I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to one of our Immaterial Network events, co-sponsored with the Creative Informatics Institute. And this event is focused on, really for me, what is the ultimate weirdness of the fact that we live in a material world, to quote Madonna. And many of us, particularly in the arts, in the humanities, in architecture, in construction, people who care about cities, we all really work with material stuff, right? We enjoy things, we enjoy buildings, we enjoy the things are made out of. And the way that we design these material things and the way we interact with them and the way we experience the places that we build are, I think, being significantly impacted or starting to be significantly impacted by immersive experiences, by virtual reality, by augmented reality. And I started this series of events with my colleague Gareth Beale, who unfortunately can't be here today, really to start thinking about what the impacts of these different technologies are in a number of different ways on how we interact with the material world. And so today's event in particular is focusing on design practice, immersive experiences, and making future places. And so this is part of our series of events exploring how AR, VR, and immersive technologies and media intersect with research and practice embedded in material culture. And my own kind of take on this is that I'm an archaeologist, so we study the whole world through material culture, through material things. And we started using these technologies in our own research and started saying, maybe we need to problematize this a little bit. And so we have a great panel of speakers here to discuss this with you today. So we have Richard Coyne from the University of Edinburgh, Pooja Katara, who represents UK SENSEcity, and I think is probably UK SENSEcity, Rachel Cruz from the University of Loughborough, and Jimmy Loizeau from Goldsmiths, University of London. And so they're going to be kicking us off with a bit of a panel with presentations, kind of lightning talks, very quick, they've promised, on their own perspectives and approach that they're bringing. And then there'll be kind of a panel discussion amongst them, and then we will open it up to the audience, and you are actively encouraged to participate, ask questions, bring your own perspectives, and discuss. And so we're going to be focusing on a couple of key themes or questions, really around how we will design and create future places and how immersive technologies are affecting how we go about this process of designing and experiencing built environments.
VR and the sharing economy. So some time ago, maybe it was about 10 years ago, some of us were working on Second Life, in Second Life. Of course, it held great promise. We thought it was the future. Well, not really. We were quite cynical about it, like all academics. But nonetheless, we enjoyed working with it. And one of the things we were obsessed with was, at the time, mobile phones, no such thing as smartphones, but somehow interfacing smartphones with the virtual environment. And so, for one thing, taking images. So you take a photograph with your mobile phone, which you could do, and then porting that across to Second Life, and then you would see an image in the environment. And so we did various experiments with that under the sort of rubric of brand and branded meeting places. So we just behind where I've taken this picture is the university's precinct, which had Old College and all these rectilinear buildings, very formal. And then here was our site, a sort of a promontory, quite messy, with various panels and devices and things that you could click on and would move around. And then also one of our colleagues, Henrik Ekius, was engaged in the task of integrating this space, as it was, with yellow columns, with Second Life, and then importing, or in real time, integrating video imagery. So, but since then, that was a long time ago, and things have kind of moved on, or at least we've worked out that the promise wasn't necessarily that easy to realize in those sorts of environments. It was a shared space with persistence, and obviously other people could come into it. But the idea of sharing is really interesting, and now we have on the agenda the notion of the sharing economy. And so the main sort of flagships of sharing these days are platforms such as Airbnb, which ostensibly, at least the way they started, were to allow us to share our accommodation. So if I have a spare room in my apartment, then I can lease that out just for a short period of time. And this platform was meant to put people in touch with each other. Of course, later on it became much more commercialized. Uber was similarly conceived as a ride-sharing facility. And there are other aspects of the sharing economy as well, meant to be sort of peer-to-peer without having to go through anything other than a kind of an anonymous platform that facilitated all this wonderful interaction. And of course, tied in with that is the notion of using cryptocurrencies. Again, a kind of a dream not yet realized in the sharing economy and some of the platforms that I just mentioned. But nonetheless, this idea that transactions can somehow be negotiated and organized without going through banks, peer-to-peer transactions, thanks to the blockchain. Now there is a system online which sort of borrows ideas from Second Life, and it's called Decentraland. And that is meant to be a blockchain-based shared environment that allows you to transact with other residents, other people who occupy the space, so you can share, trade, sell resources to each other. And that's a very interesting idea, I think. And we've sort of been thinking about that for a couple of years and how to make money on the idea through grants and so on. But it hasn't yet sort of kicked off. And Decentraland, I just went on it again last night, you still can't actually occupy the spaces. You can buy land, you can't buy other assets, but you can buy patches of land. And behind all this is the idea that in order to fund this platform, to get it going, they've set up this cryptocurrency, which it's Ethereum, and then they've got this other thing on top of that, which they call Mana. So you can speculate, or at least you can invest by buying and selling land, as I say, speculatively, because you can't yet occupy the spaces. You can't build on the spaces. So perhaps more interesting than the actuality of the thing is what the inventors wrote up in their white paper a couple of years back. And they say, Decentraland is a virtual reality platform powered by Ethereum blockchain. Users can create, experience, and monetize content and applications. Land in Decentraland is permanently owned by the community. So the emphasis here is, unlike Second Life, where it's all owned by Linden Labs and we sort of beholden to them constantly to mediate any transactions, the idea here is that it's members of the community that are transacting, and you, if you own land, you are part of the community and so on. Giving them full control of their creations. Users claim ownership of virtual land on a blockchain-based ledger of parcels. Landowners control what content is published to their portion of land, which is identified obviously by Cartesian coordinates. The land looks at the moment something like this, and there's, I think, 4 kilometres by 4 kilometres roughly, and each square is a parcel of land. I wondered if you could sort of zoom in, fly in, and see what's on these parcels of land, but you can't at the moment. All they're doing is selling, which is kind of weird, isn't it, that people would invest money, quite large amounts, in buying on this speculative virtual venture. The red areas apparently, this isn't me, this is taken from that paper. The red areas belong to the person who's published this paper. The green areas are common areas. I think the blue areas are water, and then these are roads, and then the blue area, the light blue areas, areas that are for sale. And so you can try and buy some of those plots of land. They say this is a scarce resource. So Decentraland is a distributed platform for a shared virtual world. So you can build and monetize applications on top of it. So it's a platform that you can build on. The scarcity of land on top of which applications can be built creates hubs that capture user attention. So the whole thing is sort of driven by a commercial imperative. It's how we can make money on the blockchain, I guess. So again, just last night thinking, well, can I now use assets that are there other than the land? So they have standard collections of assets, sort of sci-fi assets in this case, and I could place them on a plot of land, but I think the whole thing disappeared when I sort of logged off. But the idea of assets is interesting. Assets meaning 3D objects in this sort of space with attributes, qualities, performances. To be able to trade these with other players would be kind of cool and interesting. This is the paper that I got some of these insights from, comparison between Decentraland and a gaming environment which has sort of similar attributes. This is my last slide. But I suppose what this all raises is Decentraland, which I'm not selling. It supports decentralized peer-to-peer transactions in a virtual environment. So this to me is a kind of an innovation. Now I haven't heard enough from people here. Maybe you know about this sort of thing and even are involved with it. But the idea of selling, trading, transacting in virtual environments, and some of the assets that you have, which could be rooms, buildings, trees, artifacts of any 3D kind in a virtual environment, being able to trade those in a peer-to-peer sort of way is really interesting. Share 3D assets, behaviors, attributes, templates, variants, customization, parameters. So maybe you could set up such a system where you purchase a house, say, in this virtual environment, but you might have to pay extra for some customization of it. So there will be different degrees of access to the asset. Smart contracts is something that people talk a lot about in the realm of cryptocurrencies and so on, as well as being able to trade assets. These assets can have contracts attached to them, and the virtual contracts, and those contracts may contain conditions of use. So you may have access to or be able to unlock certain features after a certain period of time, or if you engage in certain interactions with other players, other residents, then that might unlock certain aspects of your assets that you've bought or are trading. And all of that's managed through automated smart contracts. Also management of intellectual property. So often there is a problem with 3D assets that you give somebody a 3D model. What's to stop them passing it on to someone else? Well, this contract may enable the management of the rights for what you do with these assets. Now, this is all in a kind of a fantasy world of virtual reality and this sort of these gaming platforms. I think where it gets interesting from my point of view and a built environment point of view is if we think of BIM, or Building Information Modeling Systems, or CAD as we used to call it, computer-aided design. So this is the real governance for people working in the built environment. This is where you have obviously 3D assets, but they correspond to something that actually gets put on site. And you have catalogues and directories of elements such as windows and doors and so on, and they're parameterized and you can change these things. Well, I think being able to sort of trade these sort of assets peer-to-peer in library elements, if you like, in a virtual environment, but also in a BIM or CAD system was really interesting. And then, of course, if you extend that to interfacing with physical assets, and people talk about the Internet of Things and so on. So you have elements, you have a 3D model of a chair and you have the manufactured chair, and how does the model and the manufactured item, how do they interact? And how do we interact with them? And if there are microchips in this and the asset management systems and so on, then there's the opportunity for interaction and interfacing these things, interfacing with physical assets. And then I suppose the big question is this in any way disruptive? Is this something that maybe people are enthusiastic about now, but maybe it won't last all that long because of all sorts of practical issues, problems with it? Or maybe it's just, it is disruptive and it's making us think differently about the world around us, the built environment, and how we manage it and how we design it.
I'm going to talk much more about physical assets of the building industry and also sort of, I think, drawing on some of the comments that Rachel made initially, that I think that traditionally, if you think of the built environment and the professionals that we traditionally think of within that industry, they're all focused around one thing, and that is generating our physical environment through a process that's coordinated amongst our professionals of making things. And obviously that's a very physical process that can range from extracting materials from the ground that are raw materials and then refining them. So we refine them so that the properties become more consistent, less variable, more reliable. It could be about using those refined materials to form or shape a product, and that product itself is often adhered to certain standards of production that regulate its properties, its performance, its shape, its form, and its function. And the way that we traditionally do this is through analysing the materials or the products that come out through these processes, testing them if you want to, and forming some idea or some kind of model of how they behave. Models are fantastically important things in design processes, and in some ways I'm going to kind of equate them to what could be possible within the territories of the virtual world. So modelling then gives us an access to the ability to predict things, which is very, very powerful when we think about designing our built environment. We can remove ourselves from the physical act of making, sit at a desk or wherever you fancy, use your models, whether it's a written hand equation or whether it's a complex computer model, to predict what's going to happen, and through that enable you to design. Of course, we don't always use models as just predictive things. They can generate things that perhaps aren't expected things out of the process. The way in which systems work can be very different, but ultimately that relationship that I think Richard alluded to between the physical world, the physical asset, and the model is incredibly important if we're going to start predicting or generating through design. If we have a difference between the predicted aspect and the physical aspect, then depending on how important or significant that difference is, that can really start to separate out the way in which we're looking at our design processes. So one way of bringing the physical and the virtual closer together, which is what tends to happen when you go through a production process. You're trying to be able to predict things accurately, so you want your model to match up to what you think you're going to make. One way of doing this is by refining your model, so using your model to adjust itself based on the physical parameters you're interested in. And I'm going to jump back in history. I know we talked a little bit about the idea of sort of future design. I want to sort of prove to you that kind of models come from somewhere. The example that I'm going to pick is a very iconic building that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, which is the Eiffel Tower. Gustav Eiffel and his team worked on the design of the Eiffel Tower from 1884 until its construction in the 1900s. And right at the beginning of that design process, Eiffel's design team stated a principle which defined the curve of the profile of the tower as based on and generated by the wind loads acting on this tower. If we go back through all of the iterations of the design process that Eiffel went through, right from the initial sketches to the final constructed item, we can see that the profile actually changes quite a lot. So these are the different profiles from the different snapshots in the design process, and these are them brought together. So you can see that the early two designs, 1884 and 1885, are very close together, and the later two designs are very close together. So there's a sort of step change in what's coming out of this generative model that Eiffel puts forward to explain how the tower has this curve and how it deals with wind loads. If we actually calculate, using the principle he stated, what profiles should have come out of that process, using the numbers that he was generating at the same time as each of these individual designs, hopefully you can just about see that actually what he's generating, what he should be generating out of his calculations, is very different from what he's actually got in the physical drawings that he's generating from the process. So ending up with a separation between, if you like, his virtual theory and the physical reality of what the designers would like to see on a piece of paper. This separation obviously is sort of problematic in that Eiffel uses this model to justify his design to a number of people. He justifies it to the commissioners who are giving him the money to build it, and he uses it to justify to people in Paris who are protesting because they really don't want this very large tower being built anywhere near them. However, Eiffel has to admit that because it is the tallest tower that ever was built in the 1884, he actually doesn't know what wind loads will act on the tower because nobody can get up high enough to measure the wind loads. So this model is created, if you like, on a kind of fantasy understanding of what the wind loads must be like. And in fact, you can go further and say that they still don't know how the wind loads will act and interact with this open metal structure. So you can get lots of things like wind eddies happening through the frame. For me, this is sort of a really interesting thing to do with models, in that models can be very convincing. They can be ways of justifying your design process. And I think Eiffel does in some ways acknowledge that the use of this model is subjective. He's not, and he actually finally admits at the end when he publishes the final designs that he only uses the principle in the bottom 2/3 of the tower, only uses it as guidance. In fact, he does calculations to work out how far off he is from the principle to do the final structural design. But I think what it does suggest is that we have to acknowledge that whatever kind of modelling process we're going through, whatever virtual model we have, it is subjective. And I would even go so far as to say it can be political. We can alter people's perceptions of what is good, what is right, what is acceptable. He used this principle to negotiate with the people around him that this was a good design because it would stand up, it would withstand the winds. And we have to have this curve because it is part of that generative process. It's generated through that act. So another way then of thinking about how you resolve this disconnect between making and modelling is that the modelling process itself starts to influence how we make. So if you imagine producing a product and you see a lot of variability in it, I guess the approach would be to go back to the making process and say, well, we're going to refine that making process so that the product becomes more like our virtual model. And as an example of that, I thought I would show a quick video again of a particular type of forming process that I'm working on at Loughborough. This is a metal component that is being formed through a process called freeform inflation. Typically, metal components are made through forming something into a die, so a preformed shape, so you're stamping something into a shape. Or you're casting, let's say, molten metal into a mould. So the shape is sort of preformed. This process isn't like that. There's nothing that this metal sheet is being pushed into so that it sort of takes on the form of that die or mould. It is just purely being inflated, just like a balloon. And the shape that comes out of it is one that is only constrained by a certain number of parameters. So the pressure, the geometry that you start off with, the thickness of the material. The problem with this process is that we can scan in our data of what the shapes are produced. We can produce a predictive model of what we think will happen, but there's a massive variability in the product that we generate. The model doesn't always or ever fit up with that set of data, so the physical and the model are always separated. So for me, some of the issues to do with virtual reality are how we can move away from just having elements that are, if you like, pushed towards being standardised, because the way in which we make models and we use predictive designs forces our hand in some ways to produce objects that are the same, that will behave in the same way. And it raises for me questions about how we can design with elements that have got a degree of variability in them. And perhaps even with ideas of being able to identify things on construction sites through QR codes, we can start to take advantage of the variability through our manufacturing processes. One of the advantages of free-form inflation is that the energy required to create that shape is so much lower than having to force the metal sheet into a particular shape. So it has really big advantages in terms of the environmental impact. What if we could harness this benefit and actually take advantage of variability within products rather than channeling them into this kind of notion of standardization? And I think it's a real challenge when we think about CAD and BIM, where you do get standard elements that you can kind of drop into your design project. How can we harness the ability to deal with big data sets to actually be really creative with our relationship with the material world? How can we feed back this variability into our virtual reality?
So I'm going to talk about SENSEcity, which is a company that I'm a founder of since the last 2 years. And essentially it conceptualized at my master's thesis. So I'll just run you through what the product is, and I've also got some samples and demo of the booklet for you all. So essentially, SENSEcity is all about immersive storytelling, and that's the caption that we go by right now. And it's all about stories that cities are, waiting to be shared in a more engaging way. And like I said, the project actually started off at Glasgow School of Art, where I came to study masters in creative urban practices, and my interest lied in really understanding public spaces and civic life, public life, in cities as small as Glasgow. I mean, not as small as Glasgow. I come from Mumbai, so it is small, and that's where I started reading a lot around Marcel de Certeau's philosophies on walking the cities to just try and understand what it has to reveal. And a lot of exercises were based on can we create a narrative tool to express some of the stories that the city has to tell, and that's where some of the foundation for SENSEcity lies. And I started with just walking at multiple locations around the city, talking to various people, looking up at a lot of blogs, and that's where most of the stories at my thesis level came from. And eventually it was around the end of thesis where I won an award, and I'm sorry I deleted a lot of slides at the thesis level because I was told this is a lightning talk. So I was like, okay, I'm going to keep it super quick. But you will get a gist of what the product is with the next video. Essentially, we also included SENSEcity is 2 components. It's a small booklet. It's a pocket-sized booklet so that people and travelers, visitors can carry it quite easily. And if I can get that even lower. And the second component is an application which is now available on both App Store and Play Store. And for us, really, the augmented reality was almost like a digital layer of a creative space that could complete the stories, which were all illustrations. And all of these illustrations were hand done because, again, of my interests of just drawing cities and trying to understand spaces further. We also included the audio guide that you saw because that's a medium that people relate to, and it helped us navigate them better. Essentially, we missed the characters bit, but the idea was let's actually use characters to tell these stories. And even through augmented reality, we had a historian, we had a little girl, and we had the third character who was an architect himself. I'll just talk a little bit about the journey as well. Since I graduated in 2017, we got endorsed by the University of Glasgow and set up the company last year. I'm now based in the Royal Bank of Scotland Accelerator Hub, where we are getting support, we're getting business support because I came from an architectural background. And we speak so much about the modeling, and that's the part that was exciting, but there is never business advice that we are given as a part of an undergraduation course, not even in masters. The closest I came to business learning was having conversation with clients when I was doing my internships. We've been really lucky because we have Historic Environment Scotland who's partnered with us. So when you scan these illustrations, you get different variety of mixed media. We have old photographs coming up, which is all sourced from HES, And then we have 3D models, some of it which we modeled through the help of Glasgow School of Arts SimViz. Some of it was just crowdsourced because we wrote to a lot of students who had worked on various 3D models, and they were ready to just provide that to us at an early stage. Interface was another really interesting aspect which helped us work very closely with the Glasgow School of Art. And very recently we won a Convert Challenge, which is a competition, which is startup competition pan Scotland, and with the support of that we are now working on Edinburgh's version. And we're open to ideas because Richard and I were having a chat just before the talk. Currently the product works, even though it's a Glasgow based product, you'll see when you scan the booklets, it works in Edinburgh and it works in any part of the world because it's not GPS based. And now that we're moving to Edinburgh, we're really reflecting on the product, and essentially what we're trying to do is bring AR to the streets, bring AR to making it as accessible as the technology can allow us to make it at this stage. And we want to take that to a step further when we do this for Edinburgh.
My name's Jimmy Loizeau. I'm from Goldsmiths via RIL in North Wales. Thank you very much for having me, and I'll talk as fast as I can. So I popped this slide in before just to give you an insight into my kind of architectural intentions some years ago, which resulted in this addition to the Eiffel Tower so that we could shoot a bullet at people's faces and for them to watch it stop. We did some modelling with an engineer who told us that tube would have to be nearly 2 kilometres deep. So that's my use of modelling in virtual reality. But the really interesting thing about the project, it was barely a project, is that with some branding and a few drawings, I started to put Ministry of Culture of France emblems on it, and people stopped asking if, but when this was going to be built. And I really enjoy that kind of interplay of fictions. This was an outright kind of lie, but I've used these kind of architectural kind of illustrations, if you like, to push work since then. So that was part of the lie. As soon as you put that on, everybody believes that it's going to be built, and you can have a really interesting conversation as to why. So this is the illegal town plan. This is I'm going to go straight through this, but this is a kind of bleak film that shows the town that I'm from, a place in North Wales that lost its tourist economy at some point in the 70s. I'm not going to show it because I haven't got time. In 2013, a company decided they were going to redesign RIL, and this was their scheme to fix RIL, to redesign RIL stripes. I was incensed and decided to set up my own sort of illegal town plan, which has been going on ever since, because I didn't think stripes would cut the mustard in terms of reinvigorating the town and its hope for a future. So this is a kind of statement of intent. The illegal town plan, the proposal explores the development of a fictional town plan and how this might be used as a platform or working structure to assemble and represent the voices and opinions of local community. So we were going to bypass all the kind of professions normally involved with master planning and town planning, the politicians, the councillors, the money people, etc., because all they would say is no. There was this dogged insistence on knocking everything down and building retail parks all over RIL, which nobody had any money to spend in. So So we wondered how Rill had gone from this amazing sort of town. It had the world's first hovercraft service. It had a pier. It had a pavilion. It had a monorail. And then, you know, more recently, you know, this was the kind of end of the of Rill. Basically, the fairground was demolished for yet another retail park. So you can go there now, and instead of feeling the effects of gravity and all kinds of strange inertias, you can go and buy a mattress. So my first sort of responses to this, my first kind of attempts at this, were just to reverse the fortunes of Rill, and instead of knocking the fair down through a simple kind of reflect function in Photoshop, I made it twice as big. So that's the spirit that we kind of carried on through. The monorail, which used to go very, very slowly from one end of the prom to the other end of the prom, taking people to buy chips in the West End to buy chips in the East End. We just made it bigger, and the idea was that maybe that could take us to Spain rather than all the aeroplanes that took all the tourists away. There was another kind of opportunity in the sea. People were complaining that the amazing sunset in Rill, that the only thing that the council can't take away, well, actually, they put this wind farm right in front of it. I always found this rather beautiful anyway. This is a remarkable bit of engineering. But we had these kind of schemes where we would move Rill out into the wind farm, so you could stand just in front of the turbines and watch the sunsets. And we could have all the kind of benefits of offshore stuff like tax havens and gambling centres. So these are the kind of wind turbines with sort of rides going up them. So this kind of hybrid mash of fairground and sort of pleasure or leisure thing. The Sky Tower was another tower in Rill that was also knocked down. And we were then imagining what would happen if the kind of, you know, you combined the kind of aesthetics of fairground and wind turbine. You get these sort of lovely kind of paintings done on them, which, you know, I'd like to do that one day. But that was all sort of me making these kind of proposals. So I opened it up to various forums on Facebook, and people started to suggest what they would like to me. So somebody got in touch and said they would like a racetrack, an oval that went from the town onto the beach. So my first job was go straight onto Photoshop, do a cut and paste function, and somehow represent it. And it somehow propagated the conversation slightly further. I also put in the route of my own sort of I was involved in a high-speed car chase in Rill when I was about 23, the other part of the drawing shows the route that I went on whilst escaping from three boys in a Volkswagen. So I used to work on a rock stall. That's me with the cigarette and the checkered shirt. On a sort of field trip to Rill a few years back, we thought we'd sort of get some paraphernalia, some of the stuff sort of to take back to London, the artefacts of a failing seaside town. And when we tried to buy these, we asked for Rill rock, and they said that they no longer put Rill through rock anymore. It was no longer economically viable to produce the candy for the town. So what we did was a minimal but meaningful reversal. We remade the rock, which kind of, it was the thing that we could do. You know, all those other kind of large architectures, no chance. A stick of rock, perhaps. So we did, and then this is a film about making rock, which I'm not going to show all of. Actually, I can go like this. There. Yeah, it's really nice. Look, that's how it starts off. Da, 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 da. That lady there has fingers missing, actual fingers missing, and she uses really sharp scissors. Right, so that's the making of rock. Then took that back to Rill, and this was quite a special moment for me to sort of go back home and sort of take something back. A limited edition for 300, which we used we sold them for highly inflated prices and gave the money to a local charity. What this did was it took the project. It took the project and the idea of the illegal town plan into the community via the story of putting rock back in Rill. So now through ideas going from pure fictions into something tangible and edible like a sweet sticky stick of rock, the project and the ideas behind it begin to advertise themselves. Then we've got this strange sort of relationship with it. We run the brief in Rill with the students, and for the past few years they've gone to Rill and engaged with the local community on various kind of projects, but under the kind of umbrella of the illegal town plan. And what this particular group did, they're from Ugent in China. They went to the local folk club and sang the Jasmine song, which was really beautiful. Anyway, Rill had never heard that. But what was really good about that was the local Labour MP, Chris Ruan, was there, and he got to hear about the project. So now us having circumnavigated the whole and got rid of all the important infrastructural people in a town plan. Now they want to engage with us. So lots and lots of things happen when you engage with the community, and the students did a lot of sort of imposing their ideas onto the town. This student was really kind of interested in pyramids and units of building and how Rill could develop its own new one. But basically, everybody from the local town wanted the Rill Pavilion back. So she, in collaboration with a souvenir seller on the front, had this idea to make a model of the old Rill Pavilion, which was also demolished because the dome was supposedly too weak. And the lovely thing about this is this kind of temporary reality can be built and smashed as many times as you want, and it sort of allows a lovely kind of conversation about historical architecture, but we're really interested in how you might be able to use that to talk about a future architecture. I'm talking really quickly. Neil Crudd wanted the pier. He's an old punk. He's 52 years old. He wanted the Rill College of Music and Media. Again, I went onto Photoshop and started to kind of do terrible pictures of it. I think they got a little bit better, and then this one was this is made out. The Royal Floral Hall was also demolished, which was it was a great big Victorian greenhouse. So we used that as a way to as a unit of building to build the pier, and this is it. Everyone from Rill likes this because it's made out of the old bits of Rill that they miss. So because the pier, I'll never stop trying to make the pier, and I will never stop. For me, it's a kind of reality that has to happen, and only will be stopped by my death. But in the meantime, what we decided to do was to prematurely celebrate the opening of the pier with an inaugural album, and we did this kind of call for local musicians, and if they would supply a track, we would make them a professor of the department, and then we would press an album. So this is happening now. This has been printed somewhere in Czechoslovakia. So we've got the Rill Rock back in there. We've got all the professors, Professor Javelin of the West End Subcorps Punk, and Professor Bluff, Department of the Intergalactic Space Traipse. So these are people that exist as professors now, and the album will sort of follow them through. And I think the important thing about this is this is a kind of an artificial reality, but it's also a real object that's gathered together a whole set of people in a community, and that's got kind of momentum and is creating all kinds of weird little gravities around the gig to celebrate the album, to celebrate the peer. You know, the people that want to make the posters and the tote bags and the merchandising to celebrate the album, to celebrate the peer. And then this is a little poem. I think that's it. I'll stop there.
Do you think virtual environments are a way of getting us back to the past, and that's somehow part of the allure of these systems?
It's really, you know, you've got to look forward. You can, and Real needs to kind of redevelop itself. It's never going to be a seaside town again. It's there to, I mean, it's a dangerous thing because that's how we get Brexit as well. So it's, or we think, you know, we think it's nostalgia or part of it. But the people of Real are very kind of nostalgic, but they're also kind of realistic, and you know, through using a smattering of nostalgia, like, you know, building blocks that are made out of the old floral hall, you kind of get people involved and engaged to talk about other futures because they know the tourist economy is not coming back, and so you can deploy a little bit of nostalgia here and there.
I'm feeling very nostalgic. I went to that pavilion and saw a circus there.
Wow.
Now, in 1957, when I was age 5.
Right.
Tell me it wasn't demolished before 1957.
No.
So, and I think it was painted white.
Yes.
And that slide showed the word circus on the side.
Yeah.
Of course, our family had photographs, because you would have got a stock photograph of the pavilion,
Yes.
and the circus characters all lined up in front.
Yeah.
That was where we used to go. I was brought up in Stoke-on-Trent, and that was the holiday
Yes.
place. You would go across to Northern Wales.
Until you know the cheap flights
Indeed.
took you all the way to
And we
Ibiza.
left and went to Australia. Have you guys got anything to say about the
Yes,
nostalgia
in
around
fact,
the angle?
you know, because now SENSEcity is almost turned into a product, and you have to listen so much to the people actually using it. We did a lot of user surveys, and we did one last year in November, and we spoke to about 100 people, and that was where we were really wanting to chart out you know, who these characters are going to be, who are going to narrate the stories. And as you see, one of them was the historian, and almost 90% of the audience wanted the historian to stay as one of the characters who would talk about the story, because I feel especially with AR and VR, we have the opportunity to either go back in the past or speak about the future. You know, the present is almost there in the physical space. So we thought that, you know, that's going to be a really strong aspect. And I think when it comes to the tourism economy, you know, there's a lot about, you know, heritage,
Yes.
especially in terms of narratives that one could share. So,
And you actually had a real historian. It could have been an actor playing the part of a historian.
so we had an actual historian in this case.
And
Yes.
that mattered, did it? To be,
And-
were they reading a script, or they were improvising, or?
So it was actually my history professor,
Right.
you know, who was at the thesis project, and he got involved, and then we just kind of kept going. But we wanted to keep the stories really authentic, so we were still reading a lot of blogs. We were still talking to a lot of natives. Every stop, we were taking tours of the stop. And a lot of the stories that, you know, we were told by people was also around the history. So it was just inevitably a very important aspect for us.
It's an interesting thing in that it's actually very hard to think of a world that is completely devoid of references to things that we already know of. Yeah. So if you start with a blank sheet of paper, it's very, very difficult not to go back, even subconsciously, to things that we're familiar with, which is, you know, probably why, you know, things like in CAD, you know, we draw a line, so we have an icon that, you know, represents drawing a line, rather than anything else that we could possibly do gesturally or in any other kind of sort of interaction that we could have with the virtual world. And I think that you know, we have taken a lot of the sort of physical actions of drawing, painting, making, and tried to sort of imbue them into the virtual world. And I think that is just symptomatic of how difficult it is to imagine a world that is different from the one that we live in.
So the tools themselves used nostalgically, I mean, it's metaphors in a way, isn't it? We draw as if we're drawing with a pen, but it's not a pen, etc.
Yes.
But you raise the issue then of imagination, I think. Did you say imagining? That was the other thread that I picked up on. Certainly, all four of us, what we were presenting was about the imagination. Can I just be clear about this Eiffel Tower thing? You stand at the top and somebody fires a gun up at you and gravity stops it before it gets to you.
Yes, and in the later model we use, it's an AK-47 fired through a tube of sulfur hexafluoride so we can reduce the length of the tunnel, because I actually became depressed by the depth that we'd have to go. So the
Because you wanted it to be the height of the Eiffel Tower from
yes,
the ground.
now the tunnel's only 300 metres.
So
Yeah.
anyway, there's a theme there of imagination because you had to dream that up. And it's fanciful and it's wacky.
But modelling and the imagination and this kind of transition from sort of history and the reference of history, it was very difficult in real initially to say, okay, we're now the illegal town plan. What would you like to see happen? People say, well, I'd like to see all the seagulls killed because they're a real pest, or the bins don't get collected enough. And it's like, no, come on, dream something, model something better than that. And through a couple of examples, I think Neil Crudd was amazing at it, because he wanted the nostalgia of the pier, but he wanted it to have University of Music and Media on it. So he transitioned from a historical kind of nostalgia into this future vision, which the whole album is now based on. So getting people to do that, to model those futures, is a very, very difficult thing, but they can. And I think this thing that, what in terms of the kind of the modelling of the pier now, I think there is because he's been waiting 4 years for this pier now. It's not, he's gonna have to wait a lot longer. But we have to kind of continually manifest things and objects and images and albums, and now the rockumentary, to maintain people's kind of interest in the fiction of it, and which is what modelling does. It's what Eiffel did. He revealed this great big spectacle and the realities that it was going to have to face in terms of gravity.
So sometimes imagination doesn't have to be ridiculous ideas, does it? Your ideas in your book are not so crazy, are they? It's fairly straight.
It used to be fairly crazy at one point, and that's where someone starts, and especially being with an architectural background, and even learning about other architects, it's all come through imagination. We learn about various, even symbolism, such an important feature that I see in some of the concepts, and even concepts moving to reality. But yes, definitely, I think it's.
Was there any temptation? The third thing, so I was mentioning nostalgia, there's imagination. I mean, transgression sort of comes through as well. Is there any transgression in your book of Glasgow? I regard it, we're very genteel and polite in Edinburgh, so we regard Glasgow as somewhat transgressive just by being there. But I mean, I know I've been to Glasgow, and there are places that are kind of interestingly.
Multiple people told me, why are you doing this in Glasgow? That's not the right market. And that was not even, a debate about sort of imagination or whether it's, the right city. It was just pure business sense, where people just, encouraged me to get the product out in Edinburgh. It's just, I was, there's a sense of almost comfort in where the person who belongs to that physical space has, and that's the reason why we chose to do this. And it has its own industrial, past, which I find quite beautiful.
There is an issue of market, and you're looking for a market there, and it's a commercial enterprise. You're less constrained. We CAD BIM people, I guess, are more constrained. can't be too transgressive, can we?
I think in some ways the notion of the model is something that I would agree with Jimmy. It is a sort of fantasy. Is it part of your imagination? It's, how are you categorising? How are you predicting something? And that could be based on 1 parameter, 10 parameters. How do you choose those things? How do you evaluate what's important? You evaluate what's important through your own kind of personal objectives and priorities. And so I think that the model is a very subjective notion. Yeah. And through that, you can get to ridiculous and sublime places that perhaps you shouldn't do by just not thinking about the limitations of what you've just done, which I think is almost where you go to with the Eiffel Tower, in that you've argued for this model, but then you have not the right data to put in to make any sense of it. And so you can get complete, rubbish in, rubbish out, isn't it? Basically. Although obviously I'm not saying the Eiffel Tower's rubbish.
I think the amazing, the amazing thing about the Eiffel Tower is that, that it was an amazing piece of engineering, but nobody had any idea of what would happen in the wake of the construction. If Eiffel could count every single kilo of flesh that's been up there, mind-boggling numbers to even think about. It'd say you're crazy to imagine that many people would go up.
Or even that it would last this long, because it was only temporary, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That's right, yes. And actually the way that he argued for it to A, come into existence, and B, last beyond its sell-by date, was that he was going to use it as a laboratory space to measure wind loads, which he in fact did.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of people understanding wind loads on tall buildings, basically.
The related to that, I guess, is the relationship between the physical thing and the virtual thing, which came through, the model, and then how that gets realised materially, or vice versa. And so that relationship is interesting. Now, in the case of the Glasgow book, the SENSEcity, there's the physical artifact, which is it cheating? You're giving people a bit of paper, and on the video, seeing someone with a camera and negotiating with with their iPhone or whatever. That's an interesting relationship. Did you have to think hard about how you're relating the two, the physical paper and the digital? And were there alternatives?
Right. So essentially, it always started off as storytelling through ink illustrations. The actual AR element came in much after, because I realized that there was limitations in me being able to express some of the sounds and some of the ways to express to people what the space would have been in the past. And that's where we then added this layer. So essentially, originally it was always meant to be a physical tool book almost. Right. To sort of read through stories. And when I was then introduced to augmented reality in 2016, that's where I tested out myself, with Unity, and I thought this is something that can almost complete, some of the drawings, and it can act as this. It's almost like a synergy right now, and that was at a concept level, which then I thought it did work, and right now. It's doing its own tricks because people are being aware of the product through the book, because we are distributing it at around 30-35 locations in Glasgow, and it's a tangible object which people are used to operating and looking at, and that's why we've been able to have as many users as we've had till now, which is almost about 10,000 in the last 6-7 months. So it's adding value right now in terms of. Also because not a lot of people are aware of the technology, and I was surprised myself. Once they are aware of it, all age groups are very comfortable using it, which again, came out as a part of the user testing, where we had, everyone from millennials to all the way, retired natives who were coming on and testing the product for us. So I would say we are at the verge of thinking, should this be an app only, experience where it's exclusive to the location, because currently it does act as a souvenir where people are still taking it back and enjoying this.
Because the way the tech works, you need a stable image that's somewhat unique, so that when you point your camera at it, the software picks up the image. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you know all this, I guess. Am I right? And then it maps on an image.
Yes.
By the way, the horse and carts, was that 3D? So if you move
Yes.
around the page, you would see it
Yes.
from the different angle.
Yes.
That's smart. And they're animated. The horses
Yes.
were trotting.
Yes.
Ooh.
So there's a few animations in there, only how much we could afford, and then most of those are the rest are all old photographs,
Right.
which were all sourced from
Right. And you could have had posters around town,
Yes.
which or unique. Well, even a building facade could do it if you're in the
Yes.
right spot and there's enough. The registration gets roughly right.
Yes.
So you've obviously ruled that out for good practical reasons.
We did think of a few ideas around where we'll go paint.
Yeah, you can
streets
paint on the pavement.
and put posters. But for now, we have a few postcards, and I've gotten a few to share with everyone. And it has just one of the illustrations picked up as an example, and you will see one of the 3D rendering of Saint Mungo's original shrines. Piece that was 3D modeled by HES and then optimized for us to be able to fit it within the application so that it is stable for most phones. Because even currently, as much as we want this to be accessible, it's only available for iPhone 6s and above, and Android 8.1 and above. And we were really shocked because we found out this quite late, just before we were going live. And the reasons are because some of these 3D animations just are not stable enough for iPhone 6. So we decided we'll give a good experience or no experience at all.
There's a technical problem here to do with platforms, isn't there? Because if the iOS gets upgraded to something else, it may not. What have you built it on?
It's a Unity and Vuforia currently.
What's the second word?
So Vuforia is
Vuforia.
the augmented reality sort of plugin to Unity, which is the gaming engine.
And if they change their spec for the platform, you might have to upgrade. So it's constant maintenance.
Yes, it's constant maintenance. Yes.
Yeah.
For sure.
Bit of a nightmare when you go commercial. It's great to just be academics and not bother. Any questions? Just feel free to chip in. One of the criticisms of what I was presenting, and I guess we were all presenting, was the atomistic understanding of design. That is, that you've got all these elements. So in the case of BIM, CAD, and what I showed for this Decentraland was sort of a catalogue, a matrix of these individual items, and you pick from them, and then you plant them in your world as if everything's furniture. So you select from a catalogue of furniture, arrange them. In the case of architecture, that's kind of tricky, I guess, even from a practical point of view. But in architecture, we like to think that design is more than just picking from a catalogue and arranging things. You're making environments, you're making space, and the fact that you've got these elements is somewhat incidental. How do you guys feel about that? The rock, it's just one single atom. What about the rock's interaction with, well, you mentioned interaction, how it's the center as is the CD or whatever.
I think that one of the things that we've worked really hard at is, well, actually it's been an integral part of the project, is not just showing that stick of rock on a plinth and going, da-na, we've reversed the fortunes of Rill. We've really used that rock in terms of, that it's several kind of charity outings. It's used as a business card. It's used as a conversation starter with a range of people from kind of, musicians, councillors, politicians now. So it operates and it actually does something in the world. And we're always looking for objects that, well, like the rock. The good thing about it is you can eat it and you can charge money for it and you can discuss why you're charging them £4 for it. So it becomes less kind of atomized in that sense. And the album, even though it's only, it's still being printed, it's not even arrived yet. But what's happened in the wake of that already as consequences. The communities that have formed around it and the other ambitions that are built around it have been really kind of important. So I don't know whether we've been lucky or we've just chosen very popular things like records and sweets. But they're tangible and people can work with them. You know, it's
interesting you threw in the word thing, because I read Heidegger, and one of the notions of an object is, well, it's not an object, there's a thing, and a thing has a gathering set of characteristics. I've been reading lots of student essays and things. I don't think anybody here mentioned it. I must have read it in an essay this morning, but something about the thing as a gathering, which is a Scandinavian word for gathering, or the council. And,
I haven't read that much about Heidegger, but there is the question of the question concerning technology. That end sort of paragraph, which was the only bit that I really understood, was when he talks about this kind of the gathering of people from different disciplines and areas of society to come together to kind of discuss what could happen with a new technology or a new form of modelling. And that's something that we very much, not because of Heidegger, but we've kind of embraced this kind of gathering of communities around the objects or the ideas.
I mean,
maybe it was Heidegger, I don't know.
Maybe that leads on to sort of, ideas of BIM and the way in which, this is supposed to be a platform which brings together professionals and their different understandings almost of the same object. But I think that there is a tendency to sort of atomise and to have standard objects within the system that I think that is very problematic. And I think that we do have exciting technologies like CAD/CAM where we are controlling computationally our manufacturing processes. But I think that what we haven't done yet is sort of find some kind of feedback mechanism to look at the real object and bring it back into our kind of virtual world and find some way of assessing or adjusting or gathering information from it. I mean, some of the data that I showed was laser scanning, and I suppose the most simple way of kind of inputting information, which I think you're doing through your photoshopping and modelling, is the geometry and the visuals. But I think we've got a really interesting problem in how we model the physical world, in that there is gravity. Materials do have a certain strength, and I'm always sort of fascinated watching my partner when he's gaming virtual reality sort of scenarios on TV where it is so unreal that people are just escaping the building as the building slowly kind of collapses just in time, right? And I think that the way in which the virtual world changes our understanding of the physical, is kind of interesting, because if we expect that kind of behaviour because we've observed it, what is that doing to us internally in our kind of understanding of what's really happening in the physical world?
We should do you think we're on track here with this sort of discussion? Maybe if we're talking about virtual reality, augmented reality, people are expecting us to talk and show immersive environments with headgear and all that,
Well, I can
Sorry to disappoint.
No, it's. I think this discussion has been brilliant, and I think one of the really interesting things that I've heard coming out of it that I think is a core problem in VR and AR is I think it puts us in this position of expecting to do something really different, right? We think, okay, we're going to step into a virtual world, it's going to be really, really different. And then, as Rachel, I think, was saying, and as you all were saying, it's really hard to get people to actually imagine something that is radically different, right? Like, we bring the familiar into what, for me, it would be exciting if it was a strange world, if it was a really different world, if the rules about physics and space and everything were different. And I wonder what it is that you all think, or people in the rest of the room think, is holding us back from kind of taking advantage of that as a possibility. We're clearly doing it little bits, because you're right, there are weird bits of unreality, like the slowly collapsing building that doesn't get to us in time. But maybe it's because we don't like to imagine what happens when it collapses quickly, or I don't know. But I think we have a real imagination gap in this area.
There's a problem with the word immersive, I think, which of course is one of our catchphrases for this. because it does rather imply putting your body in some kit. But we know it kind of doesn't work because you can only do it for so many minutes before you get fed up or you get tangled up, or because you need to sit in a swivel chair. That's the other thing. And too many constraints. But in a way, what we were all talking about was just on a screen or interacting with something 3D on a surface. But you can be immersed in anything. I mean, that's the other counter-argument. Anything is immersive. A paper book, mucking around with an iPhone and doing this can be very immersive.
It was that the immersions are really funny because you think you need a headset to immerse yourself into, a context with an architecture. But I have to talk about this guy Neil Crudd, who's he's a satellite dish fitter from Rill, but we were sat in Wetherspoons, and seeing him suddenly become immersed in the reality that was coming out of his head, with real kind of strategy and then detail and then backtracking was wonderful, because he literally sat in Wetherspoons looking out, and he was like, okay, it's going to start here. That street, the buildings are going to go, and then it'll go via the bistro and then straight out to sea, and there will be this. And then he backtracked, which was, he was backtracking in his kind of immersion to save the shops, actually, because he was then thinking of the economy of the students that were going to come in and then provide, people to buy the stuff in the shops. So the pier would then sit above it. So this kind of modelling that was going on in his head was so kind of sophisticated, real time, far more than one of those helmets that makes you sick. So we forget that we already have quite a pretty amazing sort of headset on, but getting people to sort of use it is another thing. The prompts and those kind of initial models or triggers that allow them to think about that rather than waste collection.
In the program, there was the word queuing, Q-U-I-N-g. Did you put that in there?
C-U-I-N-G.
Sorry, did I just say Q? I meant C-U-I-N-G.
The other Q is also good.
But what does it mean? Because I know it means.
Okay.
In this context, what does it mean?
Yeah, so for me, I think a lot about how the physical space around us cues us to behave in certain ways. So kind of signals to you how to behave in a certain way. So the classic example, of course, is the airport. We all know how to behave in the airport. And it's the physical design of that space, right, that tells you that you line up over here and then you wait over here, and the barrier gates tell you that you do not go over there. And so the physical space, I think, really kind of cues, like a theatrical cue, your behavior. And I think that, again, this is a really interesting thing when we start to have augmented realities or virtual realities, because where those cues come from shifts. And I wonder if we can have those cues from somewhere other than the kind of more virtual, more physical world, and kind of what happens with that.
So entailments, you might say. We know what to do with a door handle when we see it. It just sort of invites a certain way of holding it, especially by virtue of our cultural context and other factors, not just the shape, but the shape within context. Whereas when you go into a virtual environment where you've got very limited means of interacting with stuff, assuming it's, well, in any kind of virtual environment, be it on a screen or AR, VR, the modes of interaction or the cues are not there.
Yeah.
I guess sort of history is a bit of a cue, isn't it? This is the one that people always kind of refer back to as a way of, thinking about the future. And I think part of this, the trick of that thing is to kind of curate, the space where the cues happen. So you should always have somebody who's thinking about the future. You should always have a historian. And you should always have a taxi driver. So you've got the kind of historical kind of references, and you've got somebody looking forward, and then you've also got somebody with really strong opinions.
I was sort of more thinking of the problems that you have if you've got different sets of people with different cues. Because you could imagine a space where you can't actually interact with somebody else because you are following a certain cue and you have no understanding of what somebody else is doing because you're watching them respond to a cue you can't understand or see. And I suppose, you know, the very classic thing is sort of the cultural differences that we sort of perceive in certain scenarios. And I guess, you know, if you wanted to bring it back to a kind of building-based analogy, it would be perhaps different professions working in different ways on the same drawing, which is something, you know, definitely experience. You know, the kind of frustrations that you see of, you know, the engineering professions not understanding why there's a much more iterative process going on in a kind of an architectural environment, and it's perhaps because we all kind of intuitively learn different approaches, different ways of working that start to trespass on one another when we're kind of in the same virtual physical space.
So you're there talking about practices of construction and trades and so on, the human element of tiler doing something different than the carpenter, the joiner, and so on. And that's very enlivening when we think about the production of architecture over the centuries. But with BIM, building information modeling, isn't the ultimate goal to dispense with that sort of on-site variation. And am I right? Because I'm a bit out of touch with it now. It's sort of leading towards robotics. So you actually can then get things either manufactured in a factory and brought on site, or even manufactured on site.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sort of very interesting trajectory where you either go down the line of you manufacture off-site and your component has a huge number of facets or functions that then respond to a huge number of functions on site. So you don't have lots of tradespeople coming in. The problem that you then have is an issue of quality control, because if you have lots of modular elements coming on site, the issue is that sites are always idiosyncratic. You always have you know, things that were unexpected. The foundations were out by a couple of inches, etc., etc. And if you're always working to a certain tolerance and accuracy off-site, then you might arrive on-site and have a lot of problems, which is where I actually see the potential of being able to cope with a lot of or a lot more variation within construction materials. Because if you imagine something like a dry stone wall, it's built out of elements that are all irregular, and its strength comes from the fact that they're all different shapes and sizes, and they're all used for certain functions within the wall, either to tie the faces together, to build strong foundations, to infill small gaps. And that is a very efficient and frugal way of using materials. If we pile everything off-site and make everything to such high tolerances, such high processing value, then we're actually using a lot of energy to do that. And we're then bringing it on site and realising that site has its own idiosyncrasies that weren't, you know, part of that design process. So in some ways, our virtual world can get too precise. It can get too rectilinear and
But that's where you get the reality trespass, isn't it? Which is, you know, where I guess things actually do get really interesting, don't they? When things don't work or there's a kind of glitch in the system, it's where...
How do you solve it?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Is there a danger that we are tending to, the trajectory is tending to see BIM and virtual environments as a kind of panacea? Because, you know, in terms of BIM, you know, if you're a bad architectural designer, you'll get a bad building. So bad input, you'll get bad output. And the same is true for urban designers. So, in fact, what is really good for urban designers is that kind of that verisimilitude of virtual environments that will actually stop us building places like Milton Keynes or Brasilia. You know, because in a sense, these are places which are being built on kind of metaphors. We talked about metaphor before, and metaphor has created some of the most beautiful buildings and places on earth, but it's also created some of the worst environments on Earth. So we need to see these things for what they truly are, and that's just tools to make us better, and to make places better.
Yes, and we need to be critical of what tools we're using for what project we're working on. I think, you know, all tools have their limitations, all tools have the things that they're really good at, and I think it is about being that critical designer, which is why I think you're seeing a lot of architects, engineers becoming programmers, so that they can modify the tools to allow the functionality that they think is appropriate for their design process.
I mean, there was a time, maybe sort of 10, 12 years ago, when you could spot a building that was created in BIM, you know, at 100 yards, or a drawing at 100 feet, and there was this phenomenon of bibitecture, you know, in which you had very, very poorly thought through buildings, very poorly constructed, but the person knew how to use the software to its most efficient extent. But did the building have any kind of, you know, aesthetic or enduring value or beauty? Answer, no. So as again, it comes back to the operator. You get rubbish, put rubbish in, you get rubbish back out.
It's interesting because in academic architecture, or at least architecture in architecture schools, there's two trajectories. One, I suppose, is the BIM trajectory, certainly researching it, making it more efficient and effective, and possibly implementing it effectively. But the other is digital fabrication, which sort of relates, but it's usually more adventurous, experimenting with new uses of materials and scanning, and then printing, and printing bespoke elements. I mean, my colleagues do this, they're not here, I don't think, but a free-form sort of Bezier 3D interesting shape made up of panels that are all unique, but can be easily manufactured or printed, and then they get stitched together and so on, and you get these wonderful shapes. So that seems to be this other trajectory of which ostensibly is going in the direction of creativity and experimentation, but doesn't always necessarily have practical application. It's not as though it's something you can build your own house out of, a block of flats.
But if I may, the trajectory of the digital fabrication, in some senses, is quite an interesting one, because you can, through the ability to make bespoke things quite cheaply, because you're not having to set up a manufacturing process that is just all about homogeneity and producing something that's similar. You can very easily introduce the uniqueness that you're talking about, and that in itself, I think, is interesting, because in having uniqueness in your work, you can sort of perhaps kind of link back into sort of notions of sort of more aesthetics through the designs, and I think that there's also an interesting thing to do with how it links back into the material production processes that people are exploring through these bespoke objects. The idea that you can produce a bespoke object for a particular function has huge benefits if you think about being able to be efficient in terms of where you're putting your material for, let's say, a structure, or for fitting into a particular location. And so, I mean, I guess a very non-architectural example is the way in which people sort of look at skull damage and photograph the damage, and then they're able to build and fabricate something so unique that fits in and covers the damage in somebody's skull. And you can imagine that there are perhaps, I'm not sure, quite similar sort of applications in architecture, but the uniqueness could actually be a fantastically important thing.
How much lighter would the Eiffel Tower be if they used that generative components program?
I don't know about the generative components program, but if we designed it today to our current safety standards, it would be about 4 times lighter.
Is that right? Lighter?
Lighter. It's quite a...
It was over-designed
by
for
4
what
times.
reason?
Because Eiffel put in a lot of safety factors, because he didn't know the wind loads on the tower. So he overestimated.
That's quite the reverse of what's happening now. Think of the bridges. We've got 3 bridges now over the Firth and Forth, and the road bridge is under design, isn't it? We're not happy with it.
So it's not something I'm aware of.
But anyway, it's very lightweight. It has no service road on this.
Right.
Or they had to add it on, didn't they?
Sorry.
Humber Bridge. I saw it just 2 days ago. It's the skinniest, slimmest thing. We make our bridges much more robust with these suspension cables.
It was really interesting to hear lots of different perspectives on kind of the intersection between kind of physical and then imagination was a lot of what I think I was hearing, and kind of how our models and how we conceive of these things then intersect with the reality. And I guess I wanted to ask all of you if you felt like there was a future or a place or a use that you can see with these kind of more immersive technologies that's different from what we're just doing with our imagination, or if it's just that the imagination, the model is kind of sufficient for the practice and the medium that you're doing it in doesn't really matter?
I think, unless you want to go first, if you go on.
I think that there are different things that it enables. I think that your description of the design of the pier in your colleague's head is fabulous, in that it sort of suggests this image that he then has to translate into your head. Whereas with virtual reality and with BIM, you can sit and look at the same thing. Now, you might be interpreting that different ways. I can't stop that. Yeah. But at least it gives a common point of reference for people who are talking about a design, whether it's a horrific BIM design or whether it's something much more kind of imaginative and bespoke. And I think that that is starting to change the kind of conversations that people are having in the industry, and it's also starting to change, I think, the silos in which we're seeing. Or that have emerged from the Industrial Revolution, essentially, between the professions in the construction industry and the conversations that you have between architects and engineers start to merge and overlap, and they see things as shared problems rather than as something that is so-and-so's responsibility to sort out. And I think that will change the construction industry a lot.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I feel at the stage that we are, the knowledge about the industry and the technology itself sits at one end of the spectrum with professionals, and the complete other end of the spectrum with the the users. Be it within the travel industry, be it within the hospitality industry, and the way I see it is it needs to come closer to bridge the gap, and I see that happening in very very near future. In fact, I was reading an article the other day where there was a prediction that. Especially within the travel industry, and that's where I've been doing quite a bit of my reading in, about 84% of the travelers in 2025 would be expecting, an immersive experience. Now, how you define immersive is again, quite subjective, but the way I see it is that, there needs to be a little bit of more communication and a bridge between, the experts and the users.
It's interesting that you said travellers, didn't you? So
at this stage, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
so tourists, visitors. I think Airbnb, for example, now, going back to my theme of the sharing economy, they are now selling, promoting experience. I have a PhD student, she's not here, I don't think, looking at this. And it's about experience rather than just simply a sofa to sleep in or whatever. And that's a big deal in tourism and visitor attractions and all the rest of it. It's an experience. But I think this whole theme of sharing is really interesting in the context of VR and BIM and so on. And that was my theme, was the idea of sharing, trading, transacting as communities, as people within these environments. And I'm not sure where that's heading or if it's going to even go anywhere. But to me, that's an interesting possibility for the future. Transacting in virtual environments. What does that mean, and what might it be like in the future? And by virtual environments, we don't just mean immersive headgear, we mean all the things people have been talking about here. We haven't been very controversial, have we? Normally these sort of things are animated by hot political positions. You did mention Brexit,
Yeah,
we could get onto that. But did you want to say, last word, Jimmy?
No, I mean, I guess the only thing was and it does relate back to Brexit, because I'm a gazillion miles away from any kind of construction ever, you know, beyond sweets and sort of vinyl. But meeting the politician in Rill at the time, Chris Ruand, was talking about the death of the imagination in Rill. So North Wales in general, received huge amounts of European money for all kinds of projects, reinvestment, etc. But nobody had any ideas. Nobody knew what to do with the money. And now the money's gone. Well, actually, it's not. There's still some left over. But he was saying the terrible problem was that in the kind of the modelling imaginatively for the place, all they could do was this kind of repeat model of the retail park. And this is something that the brilliant bit about Neil and what he did at that moment was that he was not only modelling a pier, he was suggesting a whole new economic model for the town, which is what the politicians had forgotten to do. So there was something kind of incredible about that kind of, you know, it's a weird transaction because Neil and the politician haven't met, but everyone's trespassing now in really kind of interesting ways. And, you know, all we've done is act as a little kind of glitch to stop them doing another retail park, which they will anyway.
Well, there's obviously sustainability issues with any sort of initiatives in these towns.